Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Talk Speak podcast today. We're plunging straight into a major development in U.S. tech policy, the growing momentum to repeal the Biden administration's rules governing the diffusion of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, this is a big one. It's not just some minor tweak, as he said.
Right. It's a significant push led by David Sachs with heavyweight backing from Nvidia. And it could really fundamentally alter the trajectory of AI, the whole global tech race, maybe even how nations interact.
Absolutely. We're looking at potentially huge shifts.
We've got a fascinating collection of sources to dissect here. Official policy docs, industry statements, expert analysis, even a look at the geopolitical chessboard, our mission to cut through the complexity, understand the core arguments for and against these AI rules, and figure out what their potential removal could really mean for you.
Exactly. We're going to try and unpack what these rules were actually designed to do, why there's such a, strong movement now to dismantle them, who the key players are, and ultimately, what the broader consequences might be for innovation, for global tech competition, even international cooperation. It's a multi-layered issue. Definitely.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What exactly were these AI diffusion rules put in place by the Biden administration? What was the thinking behind them?
Okay, so these rules, they came out in January 2025. It was a framework for artificial intelligence diffusion issued by the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS.
Right.
And one source we look at actually called it modern history's most ambitious technological statecraft practice.
Wow. Okay, so ambitious is the word.
It gives you a sense of the scope, right? The main goals were pretty broad. Safeguarding U.S. national security, of course, foreign policy interests too, promoting responsible AI use, enabling beneficial applications but under safe conditions, and critically, maintaining America's leadership position in AI.
So it wasn't just about keeping AI out of the wrong hands then?
That was definitely a central concern, yes. The basic justification was this fear that if advanced AI model weights the sort of brains of the AI spread without any checks, they could be exploited by bad actors, posing serious national security risks. The legal basis was the Export Control Reform Act of 2018.
Okay.
But what made these rules really noteworthy was the shift. They moved from mainly targeting specific countries, like, say, China.
Right, the usual focus.
Exactly. To setting up a global system, regulating not just hardware, like advanced GPUs, but also the software, those crucial model weights, and even access through cloud computing.
Right. So how did this global framework actually work? How did it control the spread of AI tech?
The core of it was this tiered system for country access. Basically 3 tiers.
Okay.
Tier 1 nations, think close allies, Australia, Canada, EU members, Japan, UK, Taiwan. They essentially got the green light. Almost frictionless access to GPUs, a presumption of approval for licenses. First class, you could say.
Got it. And Tier 2?
Tier 2 was much larger and much more restricted. It included countries like India, Israel, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even many NATO allies like Poland, the Czech Republic.
Really? NATO allies in Tier 2?
Yeah, that caused some friction, as you can imagine. These countries faced strict limits on the number of high-performance GPUs they could get each year.
And the aim there was?
Well, according to our sources, the idea was to keep them at least a generation behind in terms of their AI infrastructure capabilities. Economy class, maybe?
Wow. And Tier 3?
Tier 3 included countries like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. For them, it was a presumed denial. So effectively a ban on access to this advanced tech.
That sounds incredibly complex to manage, that kind of tiered global access. And it wasn't just about which countries got stuff, right? It was also about the tech itself.
That's right. The rules also controlled the performance of the GPUs, based on metrics like total processing performance, TPP, and performance density. And importantly, they brought in a global licensing requirement for closed-source AI models trained with a huge amount of computing power above a certain threshold, 126 operations.
But open source was different.
Yeah. Publicly available open-source models were a notable exception. That's a key point we might come back to.
Okay.
And to navigate all this, there were various license exceptions, for specific situations, trading with Tier 1, certain private sector development. Even the foreign direct product rules were extended to cover these AI model weights.
Okay, so a really intricate web of regulations trying to control both the tools for AI development and the advanced AI models themselves. What was the immediate reaction from the tech industry when these rules came out? It doesn't sound like something they'd universally cheer for.
You're right. Not exactly cheers. While the government was focused on national security and risks, the tech industry's immediate response was, well, largely critical. Oracle, for instance, didn't hold back.
What did he say?
They called it the confusion framework.
Yeah.
And even suggested it could be one of the most destructive policies for the U.S. tech industry. They basically argued the concerns about GPU transfers were unfounded.
Strong words. And it wasn't just Oracle, was it? Other big players chimed in.
Oh, definitely not just Oracle. The Semiconductor Industry Association, the SIA, representing a whole bunch of chip makers, was just as blunt.
What was their take?
They described the rules as ill-calibrated, ill-informed, out of sync with market realities, and lacking industry expertise.
Ouch.
Yeah. Their big fear was that these rules would actually undermine the U.S.'s long-term competitive position in the global AI race. Even think tanks, while maybe acknowledging the technical side, raised serious questions about the practicality, the cost of going from a targeted approach to this massive global regulatory system.
So a real disconnect.
A huge disconnect between the government wanting broad control and the industry worrying about actually being able to innovate and compete effectively under these rules.
Yeah. And you mentioned NATO allies in Tier 2. It sounds like putting so many allied nations into that more restrictive category must have created some diplomatic headaches, too.
Oh, absolutely. Placing numerous allies in Tier 2 caused quite a bit of diplomatic friction. And economic friction, too.
I bet.
The SIA specifically pointed out that over 20 NATO allies were inexplicably put in Tier 2. That obviously created massive compliance challenges for companies operating there.
Right.
The European Union also voiced concerns directly. And companies like Nvidia even warned, look, these restrictions on third countries might just push them and their partners towards China.
An unintended consequence.
Exactly. So trying to exert broad control might have actually risked weakening key alliances. That became a really important argument for people wanting change.
Which brings us neatly to David Sacks and this current drive to repeal these Biden-era AI rules. Who is David Sacks, and what's his philosophy here?
So David Sacks, he's a prominent venture capitalist, former tech exec. He stepped into a pretty big advisory role in December 2024, special advisor to the Trump administration on AI and crypto.
The AI czar, some called him.
Yeah, that nickname popped up.
Yeah.
He's also involved with PCST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. His core policy belief, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Fewer rules, more risk.
Fewer rules, more risk. Okay.
He argues that too much regulation just stifles innovation, holds the U.S. back, and maybe lets competitors like China get ahead. His stated goal is to make America the AI capital of the world.
So a very different angle compared to the more cautious, control-focused Biden approach. What are the main arguments Sacks and others are using to say these specific AI rules need to go?
Well, the central argument really boils down to this idea that the framework just hinders innovation and it imposes, as they see it, onerous and unnecessary government control. Sacks himself didn't mince words about the previous administration's October 2023 executive order on AI, the one that paved the way for these rules. He called it a 100-page, industry-hated thicket of red tape.
Okay. Thicket of red tape. Got it.
And the current Commerce Department has echoed that. They put out a statement saying Biden's AI rules are overly complex, overly bureaucratic, and will stifle American innovation.
And they pledged a replacement.
Yes, a pledge for a simpler rule to unleash American innovation and ensure American AI dominance. Officials have specifically criticized that tiered system we talked about as just too complicated, ultimately unworkable in the real world.
It sounds like the opposition isn't just about the practical headaches of implementing these rules, though. It seems like it reflects a more fundamental difference in how government should engage with tech.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the criticism often focuses on complexity and bureaucracy, but underneath that, there's likely a deeper ideological divergence about government's role in technology. The Biden administration's approach seemed to lean more towards, proactive risk mitigation, incorporating broader social goals into tech policy.
Right, like safety, civil rights.
Exactly. Whereas this current push for repeal really emphasizes deregulation, fostering rapid innovation, and prioritizing competition, especially with China.
And Sacks has been critical of other aspects, too.
Yes, Sacks has been critical of what he calls woke AI and DEI initiatives in the tech industry. And the current administration put out an executive order calling for an AI action plan free from ideological bias.
So the push for simpler rules might be about more than just administrative burden.
It seems likely, yeah. It probably aims to dismantle not just the paperwork, but also policy elements seen as, well, ideological or maybe not directly related to just competing with China on the tech front.
Then the timing of this repeal announcement before the rules even fully took effect, that seems pretty significant. What can we read into that?
The timing definitely looks strategic. Announcing the repeal before the May 15th effective date does a few things.
Like what?
First, it sends a really clear signal to the tech industry.
Yeah.
Major policy shift happening, which many companies probably welcome.
Okay.
Second, it could be timed with broader geopolitical moves, maybe using the promise of easier access to AI chips as leverage in diplomatic talks.
With who? Potentially.
Particularly with countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They were in Tier 2, reportedly unhappy about it.
Ah, right.
There are reports suggesting a move towards direct negotiations with them, maybe linking GPU access to investment commitments or, other diplomatic cooperation.
So a shift away from a global rules-based system?
It suggests that, a shift towards a more transactional bilateral approach to AI technology diplomacy. Less universal rules, more individual deals.
Okay, so what can we actually expect from this simpler rule they're talking about? What might the new landscape of AI export controls look like?
Well, the expectation is definitely a move away from that complex, tiered global system. The idea seems to be more towards direct bilateral agreements with individual countries.
But not China.
Right, definitely excluding China. So negotiating access to advanced U.S. AI chips on a country-by-country basis.
And countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia would be key here.
They're prime examples, yeah. Countries likely to be involved in those talks, where maybe getting cutting-edge GPUs could be tied to specific commitments, like investment.
And what about China controls?
We can probably expect the strict controls already on China to continue, maybe even get stronger. Plus, there are hints about new restrictions on countries seen as transshipment hubs, places technology might pass through on its way to restricted destinations.
So simpler rules might not actually mean simpler in practice.
That's the potential irony, right? The stated goal is simplicity. But managing numerous bilateral deals, plus targeted restrictions on specific countries and transshipment routes, it could end up being quite complex to execute and maybe less transparent than the framework it replaces.
We've heard a lot about David Sachs's view. Are there other influential voices within the Trump administration shaping AI policy?
Yeah, Vice President J.D. Vance has definitely emerged as a key spokesperson, especially on the international side of things.
Right, he gave that speech in Paris.
Exactly. His February 2025 speech at the Paris AI Summit laid out some core principles. He really emphasized the goal of U.S. global AI leadership, making the U.S. the gold standard by offering fewer regulatory hurdles to attract investment and innovators.
So, echoing Sachs on less regulation.
Very much so. A key point was avoiding overregulation, which they argue mainly benefits big, established companies and stifles competition, especially for AI startups. Vance specifically called out Europe's AI Act as an example of this.
What else did he highlight?
He stressed AI needing to be free from ideological bias and censorship. Arguing U.S. AI shouldn't be a tool for authoritarian control was swayed by ideology. And he talked about a pro-worker growth path.
Pro-worker? How so?
Envisioning AI as a tool to boost worker productivity, leading to better wages, better benefits, with the initial uses seen as mostly supplementing human labor, not replacing it outright.
It sounds like there's very clear alignment between Vance and Sachs on deregulation and that critique of ideological bias.
Absolutely. Sachs publicly praised Vance's Paris speech, specifically for focusing on AI's opportunities rather than getting bogged down in safety and regulation talk.
And they both seem critical of EU regulations.
Yes, they both view things like the EU's Digital Services Act and the AI Act critically, seeing them as potential speed bumps for U.S. companies and generally bad for innovation. The priority seems squarely on fostering AI opportunities, driving economic growth. Safety and ethics might take a back seat if they're seen as getting in the way.
Vance also mentioned protecting U.S. AI tech from theft by foreign powers. How does that square with deregulation?
It's an interesting balance. While pushing for fewer rules domestically to spur innovation, Vance also made it clear the administration plans to be tough on protecting U.S.-developed AI and semiconductor tech from being stolen or misused by adversaries.
So deregulate at home, but protect fiercely abroad.
That seems to be the approach. It suggests that while the internal regulatory environment might loosen up, the focus on preventing key tech transfer to countries like China will likely remain strong, maybe even intensify, as part of the national security strategy.
That phrase, free from ideological bias, keeps coming up. What's the deeper message there, do you think?
Well, beyond the surface, meaning that repeated emphasis, definitely taps into broader cultural and political discussions. It's often used as a way to push back against initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion in tech.
Framing them as ideological.
Exactly. Framing them as ideological rather than, say, efforts to fix potential biases in AI systems or promote wider representation. So by framing deregulation in this context, the administration is appealing to a certain base and reinforcing its wider political messages.
And Vance's pro-worker growth path, you mentioned potential downsides or unanswered questions there.
Yeah, while the idea of AI boosting productivity and wages sounds good, there's a noticeable lack of, well, specific, concrete plans to deal with the potential for significant job displacement that many experts foresee as AI gets more capable.
The supplementing work might just be temporary.
It might just be a transitional phase, right? And there aren't many details on how they plan to support workers who might get displaced or need retraining for totally new roles. So there's this potential gap between the positive rhetoric and actual policy measures to handle the labor market impact. That's definitely something to watch closely.
Okay, let's switch focus now to Nvidia, a huge player in all this. They're strong supporters of repealing these rules. Why? What are their main reasons?
Nvidia's support has been really emphatic, very public. Their official statements hail the repeal as positive for U.S. innovation and leadership. They're calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to lead the next industrial revolution, create jobs, build infrastructure, cut trade deficits.
So big picture stuff.
Very much so. They've consistently echoed the Commerce Department view rules were overly complex, bureaucratic, and would stifle American innovation.
And they have a specific argument about other countries.
Yes. A key argument for Nvidia is that restricting sales to countries outside of China could actually backfire. It might push those countries towards developing or using Chinese AI tech, like from Huawei, which ultimately undermines the U.S. leadership goal in the long run.
So repeal helps ensure U.S. dominance.
That's their firm belief. Repealing the rules will unleash American innovation and ensure American AI dominance. They've been critical of the rules publicly before, even disagreeing with companies like Anthropic who defended them. Shows how strongly they feel.
So for Nvidia, it's not just about their immediate sales figures, is it? They seem to frame it as crucial for the whole U.S. tech sector's health and leadership.
Precisely. Nvidia has been very strategic in framing its support. It's not just about their commercial interest. They present it as a patriotic imperative, vital for U.S. economic prosperity and global tech leadership.
Aligning corporate goals with national goals.
Exactly. It strengthens their position when advocating for deregulation, especially in a political climate, often focused on an America First agenda.
What specific ways did Nvidia feel the Biden AI diffusion rules would hurt their operations and their access to global markets?
Nvidia saw some significant challenges. That tiered system, with its strict GPU shipment limits for many Tier 2 countries, that directly limited their sales potential in many important growing markets.
Right.
They also pointed to the financial hits they'd already taken from existing U.S. export restrictions, especially regarding China. They had substantial financial write-downs.
Billions, wasn't it?
Yeah, reports mentioned billions. CEO Jensen Huang himself talked about the huge loss of basically being excluded from China's booming AI market.
And the complexity was an issue too.
Definitely. The sheer complexity and bureaucracy of the rules created uncertainty. It made it hard for them to serve their global customers effectively. So the repeal means they can, for instance, keep shipping advanced GPUs to Europe without that extra layer of restrictions.
They also had that regulatory whiplash issue, right?
Yes, exactly. With products like their H20 chip, it was designed specifically to comply with earlier China export controls.
And then the rules changed again.
Right. And it faced further restrictions. That creates huge uncertainty and really discourages companies from trying to comply if the goalposts keep moving.
It sounds like those unpredictable shifts must have made long-term planning a nightmare.
Absolutely. Frequent, unexpected rule changes make strategic planning incredibly difficult. It can also penalize companies that do try to comply, which erodes trust in U.S. trade policy overall. That experience likely fueled Nvidia's strong opposition to the whole diffusion rules framework.
Nvidia often talks about the U.S. leading this AI-driven next industrial revolution. What's their vision for how that plays out, and what role do they see for themselves?
Nvidia really envisions the U.S. at the forefront of this transformation, generating high-paying U.S. jobs, building a global AI infrastructure, largely powered by U.S. tech, reducing trade deficits.
And they're investing domestically.
Yes. CEO Jensen Huang discussed his AI factories concept with the Trump administration. Nvidia has committed to manufacturing a significant portion of its advanced AI systems in the U.S. through partnerships.
And global market access is key to this vision.
It's central. Their belief is that maintaining relatively unrestricted access to global markets, obviously excluding tightly controlled adversaries, is essential. That revenue funds the massive R&D needed to stay ahead.
Even with competition from China.
They're aware of the competition, for sure. But Nvidia's leadership and many analysts believe major global companies will still prioritize U.S. tech, especially Nvidia's, for core AI infrastructure because of trust, performance, the whole ecosystem.
And given their market dominance.
Exactly. Given their dominance in AI chips, their push for deregulation and this AI factory vision is clearly aimed at shaping AI's future in a way that cements their central role, making their platform the de facto global standard.
What about other big semiconductor players like AMD and Intel? Did they share NVIDIA's concerns about the Biden regulations?
AMD seemed largely aligned with Nvidia, especially opposing those Tier 2 limits. CEO Lisa Su emphasized needing broad global application of U.S. AI tech to keep the lead, while still acknowledging the need for careful export controls.
Did they also face financial impacts?
Yes, they also reported significant financial write-downs due to restrictions, similar to Nvidia. Senator Ted Cruz even mentioned the midnight AI diffusion rules, weakening companies like AMD's ability to sell AI globally.
And Intel.
Intel didn't issue a specific public statement on the repeal in our sources, but they were noted as another major chipmaker whose advanced AI products would be affected by the rule's transport restrictions.
So the general feeling was negative.
The general consensus in the semiconductor industry seems to have been against the Tier 2 limits. The repeal is widely seen as a potential positive for U.S. chipmakers. The shared underlying concern was that overly strict controls limit global market access, hurt competitiveness, and risk being overtaken if U.S. tech isn't widely adopted globally, feeding that innovation loop.
It sounds like the major cloud providers and AI developers also had significant issues with the diffusion rules. What were their key perspectives?
Microsoft, for one, was worried about the quantitative GPU limits for Tier 2 countries. They feared it could slow their AI data center expansion in those areas and maybe push partners towards Chinese competitors.
So what did they propose?
They wanted those quantitative limits removed while keeping qualitative security standards to prevent tech transfer. They stressed needing a smart export control strategy, balancing security with reliable access for allies. Reports suggested they were not keen on the rules overall.
And after the repeal announcement,
Microsoft President Brad Smith publicly urged a generally hands-off approach to AI regulation in a Senate hearing.
We already heard Oracle was very critical. What about Google?
Google, in public comments on the Trump AI Action Plan, said new rules, including the diffusion rules, shouldn't put disproportionate burdens on U.S. cloud service providers and should consider impacts on U.S. market share. They argued control should be carefully designed to support market access while targeting real risks, suggesting the existing rules might hurt competitiveness.
And OpenAI, they developed some of the most advanced models.
OpenAI, along with Google and others, had urged changes to the tiered structure before. They wanted more countries in Tier 1 and Tier 2 more focused on nations known to let tech slip to Tier 3. Their point was the U.S. strategy should focus on winning the diffusion.
What about post-repeal?
CEO Sam Altman advocated for sensible regulation that doesn't slow us down and strongly opposed pre-vetting AI systems, calling it potentially catastrophic for innovation. He also mentioned their huge Stargate AI infrastructure project with companies like Oracle.
And Anthropic. Nvidia criticized them for defending the rules initially.
Yeah, though later Anthropic proposed national targets for boosting power generation for AI, warning U.S. IP was at risk if energy limits pushed development to authoritarian nations. So maybe a shift in focus there, too.
So overall, cloud and AI developers wanted less restriction.
Generally, yes. A clear preference for a less restrictive, less complex environment than the diffusion rules. Focus on global competitiveness, market access for U.S. cloud services, reducing the practical burdens. Their strong reactions really highlight how crucial they are in the ecosystem and how hardware controls indirectly shape cloud services and global AI access.
It sounds like the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA, had a particularly detailed and forceful critique. Can you unpack their main points?
Yes, the SIA's critique was very comprehensive, very strongly worded. Their main complaints included feeling the rules were ill-calibrated, made without proper industry consultation, so ill-informed and out of sync with market realities.
And they felt it hurt U.S. leadership.
Definitely. They argued it threatened the U.S. semiconductor industry's long-term competitive position, could lead to losing key markets and might push other nations to build alternative AI ecosystems, making the U.S. look like an unreliable supplier.
They also had issues with the tiering system itself.
Big issues.
Yeah.
They criticized the new tiers for not aligning with existing export regulation country groups, and again, inexplicably, putting over 20 NATO allies like Poland and the Czech Republic in the restrictive Tier 2, created huge compliance burdens.
What are the compute caps?
They called the national compute caps for Tier 2 countries impractical, said they didn't account for how fast the industry moves and could distort markets by forcing customers to look elsewhere.
And general compliance burdens?
Yeah, they highlighted conflicts with other regulations, outdated license exceptions, conflicting definitions, excluding distributors from certain exceptions, all adding up to increased compliance hassles.
So their bottom line was?
Their view was the rules imposed a sweeping U.S. government control and global licensing regime, complete with a country-by-country quota system, which they felt ran totally counter to the goal of U.S. AI dominance. They explicitly agreed with the Trump admin view that unnecessary red tape stifles private sector innovation.
Their critique wasn't just about the rules, but the process, too.
Exactly. Strong criticism on how the rules were made, lack of formal industry consultation, and their substance ill-calibrated, flawed data. It really underscored the industry's desire for more predictable, transparent, and collaborative rulemaking.
What about other key industry groups like the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? What were their takes?
The ITI pushed for a risk-based approach to export controls on advanced AI models, trying to find that balance between national security and global competitiveness for the U.S. tech industry.
And trade agreements.
They emphasized that trade deals should ensure market access for U.S. AI tech. Interestingly, in their comments on the Trump AI plan, ITI said while all their members thought the diffusion rules needed review, opinions differed. Some saw them as a starting point for modification, others wanted a complete do-over.
What else did ITI recommend?
They strongly encouraged robust, binding trade commitments through new bilateral and multilateral deals to cut tariffs and non-tariff barriers, aiming for a level playing field globally. They also highlighted NIST's important role in developing voluntary guidelines via public-private partnerships.
And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Our sources didn't have specific detailed views from the Chamber on the repeal itself, but generally their stance on AI policy usually focuses on promoting innovation and U.S. competitiveness. They typically advocate for clear, predictable regulations that aren't overly burdensome.
So likely supportive of less complexity.
It's reasonable to infer that yes. Their AI Commission has made governance recommendations. The current Commerce Department did say they'd consider input from stakeholders like the Chamber when reviewing the rules.
So ITI wants a nuanced, risk-based approach.
Pretty much. Acknowledging the need for some controls, but warning against overly broad or complex ones that hurt U.S. leadership and market access. Their focus on international cooperation and standards also reflects how interconnected the global tech sector is.
Okay, we've heard from a lot of different players. Can we try to summarize where the key stakeholders stand on these potential AI export control changes? Maybe a quick rundown.
Sure, let's try a quick summary table based on our discussion. Sachs and the Trump admin. They see the rules as overly complex, bureaucratic, stifling innovation. They strongly favor repeal and replacement with simpler rules for U.S. AI dominance.
Nvidia.
Same view on complexity. Enthusiastically supports repeal. Argues restrictions on third countries push them to China, threatening U.S. leadership long-term.
AMD and Intel.
AMD opposed Tier 2 limits. Likely supports repeal due to market access, competitiveness, and financial impact concerns. Intel's products were affected. Repeal seen as a potential win. Likely supported due to Tier 2 limits. Concerned about quantitative limits on Tier 2. Advocated removing those limits. Post-repeal, their president urged a hands-off approach generally. Highly critical confusion framework, destructive. Strongly supports repeal, believing rules would disrupt U.S. leadership in cloud, chips, AI.
Google.
Felt rules could create disproportionate burdens. Suggested carefully designed controls to support market access. Likely favors repeal or significant revision.
OpenAI.
Urged changes to the tiering initially. Post-repeal, CEO wants sensible regulation that doesn't slow us down, opposes pre-vetting.
The SIA, Semiconductor Industry Association.
Highly critical across the board, ill-calibrated, flawed tiering, impractical caps. Strongly favors repeal, arguing rules weaken U.S. leadership.
ITI, Information Technology Industry Council.
Advocated for risk-based controls. Members differed on modification versus withdrawal. Emphasizes market access agreements.
And internationally, EU officials, other allies.
EU officials expressed concerns about Tier 2, likely welcome a more nuanced approach than broad restrictions on allies. General U.S. allies likely see clarity and better access under new policies.
What about countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia, India?
They were reportedly unhappy with Biden's restrictions. Repeal offers an opportunity to renegotiate for better chip access via bilateral talks.
That table really helps clarify the landscape. Now let's pull back again to the bigger picture. How do export controls on advanced tech like AI fit into the U.S.'s overall national security strategy, especially thinking about competition with China?
Export controls are absolutely a crucial tool in the U.S. national security toolkit, especially regarding China. The main goal is pretty clear: prevent potential adversaries, China being the primary focus, from getting sensitive U.S. tech.
Tech that could be used for
Military modernization, human rights abuses, WMD development. There's strong bipartisan agreement that China is a strategic competitor trying to reshape the international order, and advanced tech like AI and semiconductors are central to this competition.
And BIS enforces these controls.
Right, the Bureau of Industry and Security is key, targeting things like quantum computing, advanced chips, hypersonics. There's this ongoing debate, though, about scope. Small yard, high fence, just the most critical stuff, versus broader restrictions aiming to keep a lead across more sectors.
Where did the Biden administration land on that?
Well, Jake Sullivan, Biden's NSA, talked about small yard, high fence, but also about maintaining as large of a lead as possible in areas like advanced chips, AI, biotech, which arguably led to the broader controls we saw.
That's not just about controls, right? There's a broader strategy.
Exactly. It's part of integrated deterrence, strengthening alliances, coordinating diplomacy, economics, industry. Though, ironically, some U.S. policies like tariffs have been criticized for potentially alienating the very partners needed for that coordination.
We're seeing more use of economic tools for security.
Definitely. Export controls, tariffs, they're increasingly used for national security, sometimes controversially. In AI and chips, it really reflects this idea of the weaponization of interdependence.
Weaponization of interdependence.
Yeah, leveraging other countries' reliance on key U.S. technologies as a form of national power in geopolitical competition. But the risk is fragmentation, pushing adversaries, and even some allies, towards technological autonomy.
So the U.S. is using its current dominance
to try and shape China's tech development path and maintain its own lead. And the very definition of national security in tech is broadening beyond just military to economic competitiveness, human rights, the overall tech power balance. This allows wider controls, but can also look like protectionism.
So given all that, how might this specific U.S. AI export policy shift easing rules for some, keeping tight controls on China? How might that impact China's own AI development and its push for self-reliance?
U.S. export controls are undeniably a huge factor shaping China's AI path and its self-reliance goals. Despite making big strides, China still depends heavily on foreign tech for things like advanced chip design and manufacturing equipment. Microelectronics was reportedly their biggest import in 2021.
And U.S. controls target those choke points.
Exactly. And these restrictions have clearly intensified China's own drive for indigenous innovation, self-sufficiency in chips and AI. They see it as a tech blockade and have ramped up strategic planning, R&D investment, talent development.
Is it working for China?
There are projections China could surpass Taiwan in basic chip production by 2027 if trends hold. The Biden AI diffusion rules aim to further limit China's access, even indirectly via third countries.
So will the repeal change things for China?
Well, the direct bans on China will likely stay. But if enforcement gets less strict elsewhere or simpler rules create loopholes, maybe China finds new ways to get tech. However, the Trump admin also plans to restrict sales to known transshipment hubs, which could counter that.
Can China progress without top U.S. tech?
It's interesting. Chinese AI labs like DeepSeek have shown real progress even with limited access to the very best chips, sometimes using techniques like knowledge distillation from Western models or using stockpiled chips.
So controls aren't a silver bullet.
They might not halt China's progress entirely, though they definitely add costs and delays. Huawei is their main domestic alternative to Nvidia for GPUs, though still seen as a generation or two behind. Ironically, U.S. controls might actually help create a protected market for these domestic champions.
What about that open source exemption?
That's potentially significant. China contributes a lot to open source AI. That exemption could let them leverage global open source advances, even if direct access to Western proprietary models and hardware is blocked.
So U.S. controls have unintended effects.
It seems so. While targeting China, they've also catalyzed greater innovation and self-reliance efforts within China and maybe spurred other nations to seek alternatives too. That sponge effect pressure leading to internal capacity building.
In the middle of this intense U.S. China tech rivalry, companies like Nvidia are in a really complex spot. What role do they play, and what strategies do they use to cope?
You're right, it's incredibly complex for them. They're key drivers of U.S. tech strength, but also the direct subjects of these export controls.
It must create tension.
Huge tension. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang saying the China market is crucial and losing is a huge loss perfectly shows that conflict between commercial interests and national security goals.
So how do they navigate it? What strategies?
Several common ones. Market diversification operating globally, including China if possible, while following U.S. rules. Product compliance adjustments like Nvidia making downgraded chips, like the H20, for China to meet existing rules, though even those got restricted later.
They also lobby, right?
Very actively. Voicing industry views to the government, advocating for policies that protect security without crippling competitiveness. Nvidia's opposition to the diffusion rules is a prime example.
And boosting domestic production.
Yes, responding to calls for domestic manufacturing. Nvidia is committed to making more AI systems in the U.S., strengthening supply chains, aligning with America First policies.
And they emphasize U.S. tech superiority.
Right, arguing major global enterprises will still prefer U.S. tech, especially Nvidia's, for trust and capability.
So they're shapers, not just subjects of policy.
Definitely. Their actions and statements deeply influence U.S. AI policy. The repeal of the diffusion rules seems largely a response to industry criticism led by Nvidia.
But they face risks too.
Big risks from policy uncertainty. Like the H20 chip situation designed for compliance, then hit by new rules. That regulatory whiplash makes things very tough.
We've talked a lot about the potential upsides for U.S. companies like Nvidia from repealing these rules, but what about the impact on U.S. relationships with its allies?
That shift from a rules-based global framework, however flawed, to potentially more bilateral deal-making definitely carries complex implications for allies. Remember, Biden's AI diffusion rules already caused discontent.
Because allies were in Tier 2.
Exactly. Key NATO members, India, Israel, Singapore, many in the more restrictive Tier 2, it felt unfair, hindered their AI ambitions. EU officials plan to push back. The SIA noted over 20 NATO allies inexplicably in Tier 2. There was real concern this could alienate allies, maybe even push them towards China's ecosystem.
So how might Trump's repeal and bilateral approach affect different allies?
It could vary. Original Tier 1 allies. Repeal might mean continued unrestricted import of Nvidia GPUs, which they'd likely welcome.
And the former Tier 2 allies, UAE, Saudi Arabia, India.
For them, it's an opportunity to renegotiate for better chip access. They were reportedly unhappy with Biden's limits. Countries like the UAE, with big U.S. tech investment plans, might be in a stronger negotiating position now.
But is there a downside for allies overall?
Potentially, yes. Shifting from any rules-based system, even a complex one, to one relying more on bilateral deals in U.S. unilateral decisions could increase uncertainty. Allies might worry about frequent policy changes based on U.S. politics, or tech access tied to unrelated factors.
Could it weaken trust?
It could. Trust in the U.S. as a reliable tech partner might erode. These policy swings coordinating on chip equipment controls, then broad AI restrictions on allies, now maybe selective bilateral deals that can be confusing and unsettling.
And unity against China?
That's the risk. A successful tech competition strategy with China really needs close ally cooperation. That could be undermined if U.S. AI export policy seems unreliable or unfair.
So if these new policies happen, what broader effects might we see on how AI technology spreads globally and on that technology divide between richer and poorer nations?
Well, Trump's goal of simpler rules and deregulation is meant to unleash American innovation. So theoretically, it could speed up AI development and use within the U.S. and close allies with easy access.
But what about developing countries?
That's left clear. If the bar for getting good terms in bilateral deals is too high, they might still struggle to access advanced AI, potentially widening that north-south tech divide.
Could there be benefits for them?
Possibly. If simpler rules, broadly lower barriers, or if open-source AI development may be indirectly boosted by controls on closed models, offers more accessible options, they might benefit. UNESCO and the G20 have stressed enhancing developing countries' AI capacity and using open source.
What about the China blockade impact?
Continuing the blockade could solidify a tech iron curtain. further pushing China's self-reliance, potentially splitting the global AI ecosystem into U.S.-centric and China-centric camps, maybe others too.
And model weight controls, their future.
That's a big unknown. The diffusion rules trying to tackle them, innovatively but complexly. If Trump's simpler rules remove them entirely, except for bans on China, etc., powerful AI capabilities could spread much faster via model transfer. That creates new global safety and ethics challenges.
And infrastructure is still a bottleneck.
Absolutely. Energy data centers, as Sachs highlighted, are key physical limits on global AI diffusion, regardless of export policy.
So overall impact?
It could accelerate AI diffusion among the U.S. and close allies, but the impact on the wider global balance in developing countries is mixed and could deepen existing geopolitical divides.
This potential shift in U.S. AI export policy also brings up some really critical questions about international cooperation on AI ethics, safety standards, and governance. What challenges might we see there?
Yeah, a big shift, especially away from a framework that tried to include safety and ethics towards one focused more unilaterally on innovation and dominance, poses real challenges for international efforts.
How so?
Remember, Biden's policy, despite criticisms, did try to integrate safety testing, civil rights, bias prevention. The diffusion rules aim for a safe ecosystem for responsible AI diffusion. Conceptually, that aligned with global calls for AI ethics governance, OECD principles, UNESCO recommendations.
And the Trump approach contrasts with that.
It seems to, with figures like Sachs and Vance prioritizing U.S. AI dominance, unleashing innovation, and being skeptical of ethics safety considerations framed as ideological bias or overregulation.
What are the potential impacts of that contrast?
Several things. It could weaken the basis for multilateral cooperation on common AI ethics safety standards. We might see more divergence with places like Europe and its stricter AI Act.
A risk of safety after the fact.
Exactly. Prioritizing rapid innovation over thorough review risks that, contradicting calls for safety by design. We might also see a struggle for dominance in standard setting, the U.S. pushing its companies' tech rather than guiding inclusive global processes. Could lead to fragmented standards or other actors gaining influence?
Human rights implications?
Potentially. If AI tech, especially for surveillance or discrimination, spreads more easily to countries with poor human rights records due to fewer ethical export controls, that's a worry. Controls on China might remain, but standards for allies and others in bilateral deals are unclear. Rights groups are concerned about tech transfer to authoritarian regimes.
What about openness and open source?
The diffusion rules had that open source exemption. The new admin stance is unknown. Balancing open innovation with preventing misuse is tricky. Overly strict controls could hurt the global open ecosystem.
So the overall takeaway on global cooperation?
A more America-first, deregulatory transactional AI policy might boost parts of the U.S. industry short-term, but could seriously complicate U.S. efforts to lead on global AI ethics safety norms and clash with growing international consensus.
Let's dig into the expected impacts on the AI industry itself and the market dynamics. Starting with the chip makers, Nvidia, AMD, Intel, what are the potential short and long-term consequences for them?
Short-term, it looks pretty positive for them. Expanded market access, likely boosted sales, especially to those former Tier 2 countries, less compliance burden, less uncertainty, maybe some relief from those chip inventory write-downs.
Like Nvidia shipping freely to Europe.
Exactly. Nvidia being able to ship GPUs to Europe without those extra restrictions is key. And the stock price jumps for Nvidia after the repeal news show that market optimism.
What about the long term?
More complex. Global competition will keep evolving, especially depending on how fast China develops domestic chips. They'll need to keep innovating rapidly, fueled by revenue from broader market access. But they still face supply chain risks, geopolitical tensions, especially U.S. China.
And the U.S. government might use chip supply as leverage.
That's a possibility under a Trump administration using AI chip supply in trade deals. Plus, the long-term challenge of losing or shrinking the China market remains, which incentivizes China's domestic alternatives. And don't forget energy and data center limits constraining long-term market growth.
So short-term gains, long-term challenges.
Pretty much. Short-term benefits for U.S. AI chip makers seem likely, but long-term success means navigating global competition, geopolitical risks, and real infrastructure constraints.
And what kind of ripple effects could we see for AI model developers, cloud providers, and the downstream industries using AI?
For AI model developers, potentially greater availability, maybe lower cost of compute GPUs. The impact on model weight controls is key. Easier global deployment could happen, but also faster diffusion of powerful AI with those safety ethical risks. It could also influence international collaboration. Altman at OpenAI wants sensible regulation that doesn't slow us down.
Cloud providers.
Directly impacted by changes to regional GPU limits. Repeal could help them expand global data centers faster, compete better internationally, including against Chinese providers, lower compliance costs too. Oracle benefits from its Malaysia plans. Google worried about disproportionate burdens under the old rules.
And downstream industries
Could see lower barriers to AI adoption, faster innovation, cheaper access to chips and models, accelerating digital transformation, but also potential labor market impacts job displacement, transformation. Vance's pro-worker rhetoric needs concrete measures.
So overall, faster deployment globally.
Generally, yes, a more permissive environment should lower costs and speed up global deployment and application outside restricted countries, driving innovation. But concerns remain about capability diffusion, global competition shifts, and those ethical security risks.
Finally, what about the effects on AI startups and the overall investment scene?
For startups, easier, cheaper access to advanced chips and models could lower barriers to entry, cut innovation costs, maybe expanded global market opportunities outside restricted areas, could influence AI talent flow, maybe making the U.S. ecosystem even more attractive.
What about startups focused on ethics or safety?
Their prospects might depend on policy signals. A strong deregulatory push might mean less focus there. Startups using open source will likely keep finding opportunities.
And the investment landscape.
Short-term boost in confidence, like Nvidia's stock surge. Continued focus on investing in AI infrastructure, hardware, data centers, energy, maybe a VC shift towards fast-growth AI application companies over long-term foundational tech. Geopolitical risks, especially U.S. China, remain key for investors. Investment in AI ethics governance might depend on policy signals.
So short-term buzz, but long-term caution needed.
Seems likely. More permissive rules could bring short-term opportunities, stimulate investment, but long-term investors need to weigh policy stability, international competition, infrastructure limits, and the inherent risks of AI itself.
As we wrap up, it feels crucial to circle back to the ethical dimensions of potential social impacts. What are some potential consequences of repealing these rules for AI safety, bias, and human rights protection?
Repealing rules could definitely have significant consequences there. We might see increased AI safety risks if there's less emphasis on rigorous safety testing and risk assessment before powerful models are deployed, less verification before widespread use.
And bias.
The issue of algorithmic bias could worsen if focusing on ideological bias means neglecting scrutiny of other harmful biases. Race, gender, socioeconomic status could lead to more discrimination in hiring, credit, justice, healthcare.
What about human rights globally?
Potential threats exist. Privacy violations for more data analysis, AI used for mass surveillance, censorship, manipulation, negative impacts on vulnerable groups. Lack of clear accountability mechanisms could worsen this. Nicole Gill at Accountable Tech worried about harms from repealing Biden's AI accountability EO. Those concerns likely extend here. And international bodies like the UN Human Rights Council are calling for rights-based AI governance.
And what specific concerns are civil society groups, ethics organizations, and academics raising about relaxing these controls?
A number of things. Misuse of powerful AI surveillance. Autonomous weapons by authoritarian governments or non-state actors is a big one. A RAND study noted China's AI exports often go to non-liberal democracies.
They're calling for impact assessments.
Yes, strong calls for rigorous human rights impact assessments throughout the AI lifecycle. Concerned that a deregulation-first approach neglects these. The UNHRC wants states to lead on international AI human rights conventions.
Risk of a race to the bottom.
That's a fear. Global governance fragmentation, a race to the bottom on regulatory standards if the U.S. significantly relaxes controls, undermining efforts for universal ethical guidelines. Tech policy. Press contrasted Biden's rules as a transparent foundation versus a Trump stance potentially leading to regulatory arbitrage.
Other concerns.
Erosion of democratic values if AI is used more for disinformation, election manipulation, suppressing dissent, lack of transparency and accountability.
Right.
Disproportionate impacts on vulnerable groups if biases aren't regulated, which groups like AI Now Institute focus on. And again, Nicole Gill's accountability concerns. Academics are pushing for multi-stakeholder AI governance involving civil society and ethics experts too.
It really lays bare that fundamental dilemma, balancing innovation and competition against ethics and mitigating social harm. What are the core tensions here?
You nailed it. It's that core tension, that fewer rules, more risk argument, pushing innovation and U.S. dominance, versus the need for a more cautious, human-centered approach focused on rights, democracy, safety, accountability.
Seen in the different philosophies.
Clearly. Sachs versus the ethics organizations and those supporting Biden's more regulatory framework. Defining that small yard, high fence is also incredibly hard with AI's dual-use nature and the broadening definition of national security.
And global governance is complex.
Hugely complex due to differing national philosophies, like U.S. versus EU approaches. It's a continuous balancing act as AI evolves rapidly.
Where does the current shift seem to land?
The current U.S. policy shift appears to heavily favor innovation and competition, with potentially less explicit emphasis on ethics and safety. The long-term consequences are still unknown, and the AI policy debate is definitely far from over.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive, a really complex and fast-moving area of tech policy. It's so clear the debate over U.S. AI export policy touches on these deep disagreements about national strategy, industry growth, global competition, and, crucially, ethical governance. David Sachs's push, backed by Nvidia, really signals that potential shift towards deregulation and accelerating innovation.
Absolutely, and we've seen the drivers, the perceived complexity and innovation-stifling nature of the Biden rules, plus that urgent concern about falling behind China. But as we've laid out, this shift has dual potential impacts. Short-term gains for the U.S. AI industry and market access, maybe fewer burdens.
But potential long-term risks, too.
Exactly. Risks from potentially sidelining safety and ethics, maybe alienating allies, or even undermining trust in the U.S. as a stable tech partner down the line.
And looking at the geopolitics, especially U.S. China tech competition, it seems equally complicated.
It really is. We expect continued, maybe even tougher blocks on China getting the most advanced AI tech. But shifting to more flexible bilateral deals with allies adds a whole new layer of complexity. The outcomes of those individual talks will really shape the global AI map.
It also sounds like this U.S. shift could throw a wrench into efforts to build effective global AI governance frameworks.
That's genuine concern, yes. If the U.S. steps back from a more multilateral approach that at least tried to integrate ethical points into policy, it could definitely weaken international cooperation on common AI ethics and safety norms.
So looking ahead, what's your overall perspective? Where might this policy shift take us?
It really does seem like the policy pendulum in the U.S. is swinging towards a more unilateral, market-driven approach right now for AI development and diffusion. The actual effects, they'll really depend on the specifics of those simpler rules they eventually write, the results of the bilateral talks with allies, how effectively they enforce controls on China, and importantly, how other nations react and adapt their own policies.
And companies like Nvidia will obviously try to make the most of whatever new direction is set.
Of course, that's their business imperative. But the healthy development of the entire AI ecosystem, ensuring its benefits are widely shared and risks managed, that ultimately depends on finding a sustainable balance between innovation and competition on one side and seriously addressing safety and ethics on the other. The global AI policy game is going to stay dynamic, requiring constant watching and adaptation from everyone involved.
It certainly leaves you pondering whether this policy shift will ultimately trade long-term global stability and ethical considerations for short-term technological and economic gains, or if it will indeed pave a more effective path for the healthy development of both the U.S. and the global AI industry.
A crucial question for us all to consider indeed.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.